Welcome to News 9 Plus special coverage from Raisina Dialogue. Here I have with Mr. Tony Abbott, former Australian Prime Minister. Thank you, sir, for joining us. Obviously, the first topic that we are going to talk to you about is about the Russia-Ukraine war. So a year has passed and there's a stalemate. Do you think there is any way out for either side in this war right now?
Look, this is a war of survival for Ukraine, and that's why I think that Ukraine will keep fighting until they have driven Russia, the Russian army, from all of Ukraine's territory. Now, I know there's an argument about Crimea, but essentially, Ukraine either fights or it dies. And the way the Ukrainians have fought with such extraordinary heroism, imagination, flair, creativity, makes me think that Ukraine can win, even though looking at two countries objectively, you would say that one is the big bully and the other is, if you like, the small victim. But just in this case, because the Russian soldiers don't believe in what they're doing, the Ukrainian soldiers do believe in what they're doing, I think that there is still considerable hope for a Ukrainian victory. But I do think it's important that the Ukraine's backers, the United States, Britain, and the East European countries, give the Ukrainians the weapons they need to win.
So time and again, Ukraine has been asking for more weapons, more support, even till recently. Do you think it's so critical right now that if they don't get that much of support, their defense is going to collapse?
I don't believe that there's going to be a collapse of Ukrainian morale. I think what is much more likely is a collapse of Russian morale. What we saw in the summer was that the Russian forces effectively disintegrated in the face of the initial Ukrainian counterattack. If the Ukrainians are able to mobilise enough tanks to counterattack in the right place, I think there's no reason why there couldn't be another collapse of the Russian forces. So obviously it is an unequal struggle. Nevertheless, the Ukrainians are convinced that they have right on their side. I don't think anyone would say that the Russians have right on their side, even the Russians themselves.
So Russian Foreign Minister today at the event lashed out at the Quad, at the Asia Pacific, all the cooperation that is going on, saying that, you know, this is all in a way trying to target Russia. Is there any sense of even a point of truth out there in that statement?
Lies and self-delusion, absolute self-delusion. This idea that NATO was somehow threatening Russia, the idea of the Baltic states invading Russia, nonsense. The idea of Poland invading Russia, nonsense. The idea of Ukraine invading Russia, nonsense. The reason why all of the Eastern European countries rushed to join NATO was because they know that there is a streak in the Russian polity, of which Putin is an extreme example, a streak in the Russian polity that is aggressive and imperialistic. And just as Germany and Japan were purged of their imperialism by defeat, I think Russia needs to be defeated to be purged of this imperialism.
He points out, you know, that when Afghanistan debacle happened, when US pulled out, in different forums across the world, there was not so much of outcry vis-a-vis when Russia invaded Ukraine. So he's pointing out the difference, you know. See, when, let's say, even if you're wrong, there's so much of hue and cry about it. But when it considers US situation, there's not much, there's very muted response to that kind of situation.
Well, I don't think they're analogous situations. I don't really think there are parallels. Afghanistan had given sanctuary to Al-Qaeda, and we saw what Al-Qaeda did from their training bases in Afghanistan. And Iraq was in breach of the UN resolutions again and again and again. So there's just no parallel between what happened in Afghanistan, what happened in Iraq, and what Russia has done to Ukraine. Ukraine was a threat to no one. It was menacing no one. It had suspended its application to join NATO and to join the EU. President Zelensky, in the days before the invasion, was actually being critical of the Americans for talking up the possibility of an invasion. So he did everything he could to avoid the conflict, but unfortunately Putin was implacable. Putin believes he is on a mission from God to restore the Russia of Peter the Great. And if eventually he does claim Ukraine, the Baltic states, Poland, Georgia, Moldova, all the other parts that he sees as belonging to Greater Russia are at grave risk. And at the very least, if Putin does win, there will be a new Iron Curtain down the heart of Europe, and that will be disastrous for Europe, and it will be very, very bad for the whole world. And frankly, if anything here, the Ukrainians are fighting for the freedom of all of us, and I sometimes feel a little guilty that even in faraway Australia we aren't doing more to help.
So you've been coming to India for quite a while right now. With Raisina Dialogue here, the G20 year right now, how does this event where you are right now is going to help India set the stage as a global power that is emerging right now?
I've always been a big fan of India ever since I travelled here for 3 months as a backpacking student in the early 1980s. And there is no doubt that in recent years India has emerged as the world's second democratic superpower, and I think it's so important that the world has another democratic superpower right now. I think as time goes by, India is just going to get stronger and stronger, because India has the priceless gifts of democracy, the rule of law, to some extent the English language, which is a great advantage. And I think the Indian character is benign. India has never menaced its neighbours. In fact, India has gone out of its way to be helpful to its neighbours. Yes, there have been one particular neighbour that's been extremely difficult, but India has been remarkably forbearing. And I think that, well, just as the 19th century was a British century, the 20th century was an American century, I think there's every chance that the 21st century could be the Indian century. And I do believe that if there is to be a leader of the free world 5 or 6 decades hence, it's as likely to be the Prime Minister of India as the President of the United States. So I'm a great optimist about India. I'm a great supporter of India, and certainly in my own country I want to be a great champion for India.
One of the last questions would be, another superpower emerging is China. China and India have been a lot of differences over the border issues for a long while now, which was escalated a couple of years ago. In this situation where there's an emerging power like India, and China is also an emerging power, is there a situation for the nations around to choose a side out here, or is there a way out that the growth can be balanced for both the countries in this 21st century?
Look, democratic countries don't want to fight with anyone, and I don't see India spoiling for a fight with anyone. Australia certainly isn't spoiling for a fight with anyone, but we have seen assertiveness verging on belligerence from China. India has experienced this on its shared border with China. Vietnam experienced this some time ago. And of course there's the 24/7 menacing of Taiwan. Now, the Ukraine war has been catastrophic, but any Chinese attack on Taiwan would be several orders of magnitude worse and more disruptive, and that's why it's critical that the world's democracies make it crystal clear to China that any aggression across the Taiwan Straits will have catastrophic consequences, because the only way to prevent an aggressive regime, as the Beijing communist regime is, from taking advantage of a situation is to be strong. Weakness invites aggression, strength deters aggression. Beijing needs to understand that any attack on Taiwan would not just be China attacking 23 million liberal democratic citizens, it would be effectively China taking on a vast coalition of democracies.
My last question to you, China and India have a vibrant trade going on despite this setbacks at the border. On the global scale, the free trade agreement that was, you must be obviously known to that. How does that balance change if there's this skirmishes like this, or if the war continues between Russia and Ukraine?
Well, obviously, nothing is more disruptive to trade, and nothing is more damaging to prosperity than war. And the problem with trading with China, as Australia has found very much over the last few years, is that China treats trade as an arm of politics, and it can easily decide to weaponise trade against you. For instance, over the last couple of years, there's some thawing of the problem just at the moment, but over the last couple of years, some $20 billion of Australia's trade with China has been capriciously suspended on bogus grounds as a means of punishing Australia for being A, an ally of the United States, B, a member of the Quad, and C, the country that first called for a full, independent and impartial investigation into the Wuhan virus. So we know what trade with China is like, and of course China has done this to our trade, notwithstanding the free trade agreement which I happened to finalise with China back in 2014. So look, there's a ruthlessness about the Beijing regime that we have to be realistic about. And as I keep stressing, there is absolutely nothing wrong with the Chinese people. They are like people everywhere, basically decent, basically want to get along with each other and with everyone else. But there is something about the communist regime in Beijing which right now is quite menacing to the wider world.
Thank you, Mr. Abbott, for speaking to News 9+. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.